Hi, I'm Jonah, and this is a Discover New Sounds video for the relative diatonic major scale. Kind of a mouthful. This is a diatonic scale, which means that it has 7 notes, versus the pentatonic scale, which is that scale that we all first learn to play when we're playing the native flute. That has 5 notes. So there's a little more notation, a little more notes to play with on that. Now, that being said, it's also a more complex scale in that it uses a lot of cross-fingerings and some pretty big cross-fingerings. So I would consider this to be more of an intermediate level scale to play in. That being said, if you're a beginner, I really think you should give it a go. But just know that if you're finding yourself getting frustrated with the cross-fingerings and the dexterity is taking a long time to learn, give yourself some patience and know that this is more of an intermediate level scale to play in. Now, we get a lot of requests for this scale, and that's why we're doing it. And it's a great scale, and there's a lot of modern music that's played in this scale. It's probably the most common scale. So I think you'll really enjoy learning it. Now, the way this will work is I'll show you the scale physically on the flute, and then I'll put up the fingering diagram that shows the scale in like a tablature form. And then I'll play a little improvisation on this in the scale. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the scale. Now, one of the things to notice is that I'm starting on this note. So this is one of the things that makes this scale really different than the pentatonic minor, is that I'm starting on a different note. And I'll talk more about this as I move through the video. This is the fingering chart for the relative diatonic major scale, and I've marked off the tonic note here with this black mouthpiece and the word tonic because it's a really important note. It's the first note in the scale, and it's also the note that the scale is named after, and I go through more about that in the last part of the video. Now, I also wanted to point out that the note below it is a half hole, and this is the note below the first note in the scale. And I put it there because you can play it. It's an available note that's within the scale. So it's helpful to have that there so that you know all the notes that most native flutes can play within this scale. And then these are alternate fingerings for lower tone flutes. Depending on the flute, that could be a mid-tone G, mid-tone F sharp, and definitely the bass tone flutes. And if you find that these fingerings here don't work for you to get to the higher notes, give these a try and experiment with them to see if you can catch the higher notes with these alternate fingerings. Some flutes, like deeper bass tone flutes, especially when you start getting deeper, like a bass tone E and deeper, usually won't get the high notes right on pitch. Usually it'll sound pretty good still, but try these alternate fingerings and find what sounds the best, and then that's what you have to work with. Now this scale has a lot of cross fingering in it, so it might take some time to learn the dexterity of playing it, and you really want to take time with it because it wants to be spontaneous. You want that improvisation to be able to come out spontaneously when you're playing the scale. So take some time with the fingering chart and just really walking up and down the scale to teach your fingers the dexterity, and especially in these areas where these cross-fingerings, the cross-fingerings are these spots where you're closing one hole and opening another at the same time. And so really just go back and forth, and over time your fingers will learn the dexterity of it, and it'll become kind of second nature, and that's really what you're looking for. You know, especially when you start getting up to these high notes and you're doing these kind of large cross fingerings. So take some time with that. Now each scale will have a tonic note, and that's the note that the scale is based around, and it's the beginning and the ending place most of the time for songs using that scale. And it has a beginning feel to it and an ending feel or a pausing feel as well. It has a lot of resolve, a lot of like finishing feel to it when you play it. And so when you're playing the scale, you can really go back to that note a lot. Now, there's also other sequence of notes within scales that will give it kind of its characteristic feel. And in this particular one, it's the half hole that you see in the fingering chart that I didn't actually use in the improvisation I did, but it's a real characteristic tone, feel of going to the half hole and then going back to the tonic. It has this real finality to it, you know, this real ending feel to it when you go to that note and then back to the tonic. So be sure to play around with that note. And the other note sequence that I really find to give this scale its feel is this sequence here. Here to here to here. So that sequence of notes going in any direction, you can, different combinations of it. It's not necessarily the melody I'm playing, it's that sequence of notes that gives it that feel to it, that the scale really provides for pulling out new melodies within you. So be sure to play with those, that particular note sequence as you're playing your improvisations. Real kind of explore that sequence in different ways. The last thing I'm going to go over is the name of the scale and what it means. So we're learning the relative diatonic major scale, and I'm going to go through it backwards. So it's a major scale, which means that it has kind of a lively, upbeat feel to it, versus the minor scales, which are more contemplative, kind of have an emotional feel to them. And the traditional scale, that first scale that we all learn on the native flute, is a minor scale. So it has that kind of contemplative, emotional feel, where this scale that we're learning is going to have more of an upbeat, a livelier feel. So it's going to pull out different songs because of that, just that alone. It's also, the scale we're learning is a diatonic scale, which means that it has 7 notes versus the pentatonic minor scale that we first learned to play on the native flute, which only has 5 notes. So it has some more notes to play with as well. So that gives us a little more to be creative with as well. Now, it's the relative diatonic major scale. And what does the relative mean? It's in relation to the pentatonic minor. They're related, they're family, so they're related, but they're different. And one of the ways that they're different is they're in different keys. And so in this section, I'm going to go over how to find what key you'll be playing in when you're playing the relative diatonic major scale on your flute. Now, if you're going to be playing just on your own, you're just doing your kind of own improvisation stuff, or you're playing with other flutes that are in the same key as your flute, then you can kind of skip over this next section. You don't necessarily need to learn what scale, like what the key is, the very specifics of what key you're playing in, because it'll sound great the way it is and you're not playing with somebody else. But if you're playing with somebody else, like another instrument like a piano or a guitar or something, other than another native flute in the same key, then you're going to want to learn how to find what key you're playing in, because that's critical for them to know so that they can play in the same key with you. So your native flute is based on a pentatonic minor scale. So it's a minor scale and it's in a key. Most flutes have the key on them on the back, like high spirits flutes will have the key on the back, or in some way you'll need to know what the key is of that flute. So your native flute is based on a pentatonic minor scale, and that scale is in relation to the relative diatonic major scale that we're learning here. And the way that they relate is they share a lot of the same notes. They have a lot of commonality between them. However, they're in different keys. And that's because the tonic note, which is the first note in any scale, and it's also the key that the scale is named after, for example, key of A or key of G, changes. It goes from this note in the pentatonic minor scale to this note in the relative diatonic major scale. And therefore, the key that you're playing in changes. And one way to figure out what key you're now playing in when you're playing the relative diatonic major scale on your flute is to use this chart that comes in the back of the High Spirits instructional booklet. The booklet can also be downloaded from our website. And the way that you use this chart is you'll find the key of your flute in this column here. You'll go over 2 columns to this column here. And this is going to be the new key that you're going to be playing in when you're playing the relative diatonic major scale. For example, if your flute's in the key of A, then you find A here. You go over 2 columns, and we see that there's a C in this column. And that means that when you're playing the relative diatonic major scale on this flute, you're playing in the key of C. Another example would be if your flute's in the key of D. You go to the D here, we move over 2, and we see there's an F in this column. So when you're playing the relative diatonic major scale on a flute in the key of D, you're now playing in the key of F. One more. So if your flute's in the key of F sharp, we go here to F sharp, over to here. You're now playing in the key of A when you're playing the relative diatonic major scale on a flute that's in the key of F sharp. And that's because the tonic note changed from this note to this note, and therefore our key changes. So that's a really good overview of the relative diatonic major scale. And I hope you get a lot out of this video and you discover new sounds on your native flute, and it helps you find new ways to play. I think it went out of the scale for a second there. It happens.